Boa tarde, senhoras e senhores. E antes de iniciarmos o painel, peço a atenção de todos para a cerimônia do pêndulo.
Precisamos de 100 pessoas. 100 pessoas com o mesmo propósito. Vamos, ao mesmo tempo, apertar um botão que está instalado na lateral da mesa. Numa atitude conjunta, criaremos assim o que ainda não há: uma humanidade. Uma primeira, incompleta, imperfeita, magnífica humanidade. E o mundo encontrará o seu prumo. Já!
Painel Iniciativa Conjunta sobre Sustentabilidade Urbana, JUS, catalisando investimento em sustentabilidade urbana. Organizador, Environment Protection Agency, EPA, Estados Unidos. Ministério do Meio Ambiente do Brasil, Governo do Estado do Rio de Janeiro e Prefeitura do Rio de Janeiro. À mesa, senhora Johanna Partin, diretora do Programa das Cidades Global C40, Estados Unidos. Senhor Rodrigo Rosa, assessor especial do prefeito e coordenador executivo da Prefeitura para Rio+20. Senhor Andrew Stolber, chefe de gabinete do prefeito para Transporte e Utilidades, cidade da Filadélfia, Estados Unidos. Senhor Walter de Simone, supervisor de Economia Verde da Secretaria do Meio Ambiente do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. E senhora Shaline Vajarala, representante especial do gabinete do administrador da Agência Americana do Meio Ambiente, EPA. Passo a palavra ao moderador. Momento. A senhora Johanna Partin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the panel this afternoon on catalyzing investment in urban sustainability. Today we will be talking about efforts at the local and national and subnational levels to catalyze sustainability and efforts between different levels of government to promote sustainability. Some of the things we will be talking about this afternoon are how governments can support greener, more inclusive development in urban areas. We'll be examining how governments can work with the private sector to catalyze investment in urban areas and populations. And we'll also be examining how governments can use their convening power to bring various actors and stakeholders together for mutual benefit. So we will start with some questions and discussion among our panelists. and then we'll open it up to the audience for question and answer for the last 30 minutes or so. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. I'll start with the gentleman on my right. Walter De Simone is the Green Economy Superintendent for the state of Rio de Janeiro. He's an environmental economist and has worked since 2007 in environmental finance, carbon markets, and sustainable development. In his current position, Mr. De Simone was instrumental in the development and design of the state of Rio de Janeiro's strategy for a green economy, helping to build a new subsecretariat in the State Secretariat of Environment dedicated to this issue, alongside Subsecretariat Susanna Khan and Secretary Carlos Mink. He also oversees the design, development, and execution of projects, including the Green Development Poles, Bolsa Verde Rio, and Green Development Districts, among others. Next is Mr. Andrew Stober. He works as the Chief of Staff in the Mayor's Office of Transportation and Utilities for the City of Philadelphia. And as Chief of Staff for the City of Philadelphia's Office of Transportation, he works with executives across government to manage and advance the on-street transportation network, sanitation and recycling, the Philadelphia International Airport, the Philadelphia Water Department, the city's energy policy, and the city's relationships with owners of significant infrastructure. He's secured tens of millions of dollars in grants for the city transportation projects and reestablished the city's energy office, led bicycle, pedestrian, and transit initiatives, and serves as a spokesman for the mayor on transportation and energy issues. To his right is Mr. Rodrigo Rosa. He's a special advisor to the mayor of Rio de Janeiro and manager of the Sustainable Development Program of the city of Rio. Rodrigo Rosa was also appointed by the mayor of Rio as executive coordinator for Rio Plus 20 for the Rio de Janeiro municipality. A former legislative consultant for the Senate of Brazil, he also worked previously as an economic reporter for major newspapers in Brazil, such as the Folha de São Paulo and Jornal do Brasil. Rodrigo holds a Bachelor in Communication and Journalism from the University of Brasilia and a Master in Public Economics at the University of Brasilia, an Executive Master's in Environmental Business Management from the COPE of the Federal University of Rio. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shalini Vajhala. She was appointed to the position of Special Representative in the Office of Administrator Lisa Jackson in November 2011. In this position, Dr. Vajhala leads the U.S.-Brazil Joint Initiative on Urban Sustainability, also known as JUICE, a bilateral partnership announced by President Obama and Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff in March of 2011. Most recently, Dr. Vajhala served for 2 years as Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Office of International and Tribal Affairs at the U.S. EPA and as Deputy Associate Director for Energy and Climate at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Dr. Vajhala joined the Obama administration from Resources for the Future, an environmental and natural resources think tank in Washington, D.C., where she spent several years researching global development and environmental policy issues. So, Dr. Vajhala, I'd like to start with you, if I might. One of the initiatives mentioned in your introduction was the U.S.-Brazil Joint Initiative on Urban Sustainability, a presidential initiative launched in 2011. What are the principal elements of this initiative, and how have you approached the problem of constraints on investment in green initiatives?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Johanna, and it's great to be among a panel of juice makers, as we call ourselves in this initiative. The Joint Initiative on Urban Sustainability was a vision articulated by both President Obama and President Dilma, and it focused on a few big problems that we recognized we shared between our countries. We share priorities of reinvesting in our communities, of promoting development of infrastructure, and doing so in ways that are economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable. But we saw a few challenges, and we knew that we needed to work across levels of governments and with partners outside of government to be able to solve these challenges. The first problem that we understood was that we are seeing tremendous leadership at the city level. 2 examples in Rio and in Philadelphia. But we're also seeing lack of ability to attract investment to urban infrastructure. And even with all the government emphasis on investing in infrastructure, what we recognized was we have a real problem of matching big money and small projects. So what do I mean by that? Green infrastructure or sustainable infrastructure is typically small. It's made up of a lot of small pieces and parts, and that's generally what makes it green. So the difference between a gray system that has large power plants or large water treatment plants and big pipes or big transmission lines is very different than the green system that has thousands of trees and many different green roofs and repaved roads. It's much more difficult to finance small things than big things, surprisingly. You would think that we have a problem of money, but it's actually a problem of directing money to the right investments on the ground. And so through the JUICE, what we saw was an opportunity to work with two cities that are among the many here leading the charge on green infrastructure to create a new approach for attracting private investment by, instead of focusing on projects, actually building whole portfolios for private investors to come together and invest in many, many sustainable infrastructure projects instead of just small pilots or demonstrations. So what this accomplished was we were able, through the JUICE, to change the conversation about scaling up investment in sustainable infrastructure. Instead of trying to make a small project bigger and still make it green, what we've been doing is focusing on bundling together lots of small projects and attracting large finance. So it's scaling by volume rather than size. The second big problem that we saw, and this is also the benefit of green infrastructure, is that green infrastructure has multiple benefits. You would think this would be a good thing. But what it does is it challenges cities that can typically only pay for infrastructure in one or a few ways. And instead of being able to attract investment based on generating all of these diffuse benefits, so for example, where a new water system helps save energy, or where it helps investments in transportation or repaving roads, the water department can't get money from the roads department to pay for the system. But you should be able to attract money from the private sector. So what we've been doing through the JUICE is actually bringing together companies, investors, and leading state and local officials to be able to capture savings in a city and develop the institutional mechanisms that allow us to finance green infrastructure based on all of its benefits, not just based on one or two. And those are the main things that we saw as opportunities in the JUICE rather than as barriers. And by working with cities as different as Rio and Philadelphia, we were able to identify some of the common challenges, common approaches, and together build what we have thought of as a cookbook for building greener economies and smarter cities, to understand where policy, finance, and projects intersect to create real change on the ground for communities.
Great, thank you. Rodrigo, one of the things that Shalini mentioned was the tremendous leadership at the city level, and Rio is certainly held up as one of those leaders and has been very involved in the JUICE project as well. Rio, for example, is one of the few emerging economies that's been able to actually reduce carbon emissions over time, which is very impressive. Can you talk a little bit about your work as the Director for Sustainability for Rio and how some of the issues of working to build up investment and to support efforts at the local level, how you've addressed that in Rio?
Bom, em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos aqui, esperar um pouco os meus colegas estrangeiros botarem a tradução. Eu gostaria de felicitar principalmente a Shalini aqui, que foi uma das principais articuladoras e desde o início levou esse projeto adiante, né? A gente sabe como é que é a rotina diária de governos e todo mundo ocupado, enfim, sempre essas iniciativas de cooperação e troca de experiências por vezes acabam perdendo espaço para aquelas demandas urgentes. Então, mas eu acho que havia um sentido de planejamento estratégico naquilo, e hoje a gente está celebrando essa reunião já com essa coleção, eu diria, de boas práticas verdes, né, entre Rio de Janeiro e Filadélfia, e construindo essa, na verdade, que é uma plataforma, né, de uso, uma plataforma com técnicas e modelagens para a gente desenhar estratégias para a economia verde. A gente discute muito economia verde, né? Eu gosto de fazer aquela piada, vou fazer aqui de novo, de que a economia verde parece sexo na pré-escola. Todo mundo fala, mas ninguém sabe o que é. Então, eu acho que aqui a gente tá... Dessa vez ninguém riu, né? A piada já foi melhor. Mas eu acho que a gente está aqui desenhando essas estratégias. E eu gostaria de felicitar, eu acho que o Poco Rio vive um momento muito especial. Acho que a Rio+20 é emblemática, é o primeiro dos grandes mega eventos internacionais que a cidade vai receber, né? Temos aí a Copa do Mundo daqui a 2 anos e depois as Olimpíadas. E eu acho que está sendo um marco, primeiro testando a cidade do ponto de vista logístico. A gente teve aí sempre aquela discussão de última hora, tem hotel, não tem hotel, a cidade como é que vai comportar, o trânsito, etc. Mas também uma oportunidade para redesenhar, né, fazer a cidade se transformar, né? O prefeito Eduardo Paes, assim que o Rio venceu as Olimpíadas, esteve com Pascal Maragall, que foi prefeito de Barcelona, e eles conversaram. E Barcelona é considerado um símbolo de como aproveitou a oportunidade para poder se reinventar. E ele disse uma frase que se tornou vamos dizer assim, um mantra para a gente, que é: os jogos não podem se servir da cidade, a cidade que tem que se servir dos jogos. Eu acho que essa agenda olímpica, essa agenda de oportunidades é a agenda verde, né? Eu acho que eu comparo um pouco o Master Plan das Olimpíadas como quando foi apresentado ao Comitê Olímpico Internacional, já era quase como um rascunho de um plano estratégico para a cidade nos próximos anos, ainda na possibilidade, e como aquilo deixou um legado, né? Foi redesenhado, incorporado, ganhou novas, vamos dizer assim, novas formas, novos instrumentos. E hoje a gente compara como esse plano tem evoluído na direção do desenvolvimento sustentável, né? Vai desde o aspecto micro de implementar um sistema de aluguel de cidades, de bicicleta nas cidades, como o Bike Rio, né? Até no âmbito mais macro, de você tirar da gaveta um projeto de corredor de ônibus expresso, que era na época o corredor T5, né? Quem estava aqui se lembra, que era um projeto que dormia há 30 anos na gaveta, e hoje nós temos 4 projetos de BRTs em desenvolvimento, né? A Transoeste acabou de ser inaugurada, começa a operar de forma definitiva em agosto. A Transbrasil, que era o último que faltava, foi recentemente licitada. Enfim, eu acho que a gente está conseguindo aproveitar esse momento, né? E eu acho que essa experiência, dividir essa experiência com a cidade de Filadélfia, o meu colega aqui, Andrew, me trouxe a notícia de que o prefeito de Filadélfia se tornou o prefeito da Confederação dos Prefeitos, o presidente da Confederação dos Prefeitos dos Estados Unidos. Quer dizer, são 2 cidades que têm um papel de liderança, né? Filadélfia, eu estive lá no início do ano, pude observar as iniciativas na área de saneamento. Enfim, temos muito a aprender. E fico feliz agora que essa plataforma esteja sendo incorporada ao C40. Eu acho que é um pouco esse trabalho, ele vai se reforçando e construindo. O C40, que no fundo, é uma rede de cidades muito, muito preocupada com políticas de mudanças climáticas, né? Nesse desenvolvimento de estratégias para reduzir emissões de gases do efeito estufa. A gente sabe do problema que as cidades irão enfrentar com as mudanças climáticas. Vai se aproveitar bastante dessa coleção de boas práticas e dessa possibilidade de articular atores do setor privado, do setor público, da sociedade civil, para poder replicar essas boas experiências de sustentabilidade e, enfim, incorporar cada vez mais. E eu espero que o JUS nasça com Rio e Filadélfia, mas que se multiplique por inúmeras cidades de todo o mundo e incorpore também essas práticas dessas cidades.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Andrew, wondering if I can move to you next. And Philadelphia is another city, as Rodrigo mentioned, that's been held up as a leader in a number of areas. And wondering if you can talk a little bit about your work in Philadelphia and specifically your work as it pertains to the JUICE network, what you're working on there. And also the groundbreaking agreement, I think, that you have with US EPA on your water infrastructure.
Sure. I don't know if the slide that I was going to share can be put up. We'll see. Yep, there it is. So that, I think this slide is actually a good place to start the conversation. That's from the 1870s or 1880s, and those are probably Italian and Irish immigrants building the Mill Creek sewer through West Philadelphia, which is a huge piece of infrastructure. And just 50 years later, or 50 or 60 years later, in the 1930s, houses started to fall down in this neighborhood as a result of this sewer being built. One person was killed and 4 were injured. Then 30 years later, in 1961, another 4 people were killed and 100 homes were condemned. And it's an important reminder for all of us, and particularly for cities who have the opportunity to make big investments, that they think about their investments in infrastructure as being assets for future generations, not liabilities for future generations. So here is a big piece of infrastructure which had very important public health benefits when it was constructed, but became ultimately a liability for the city. And so the work of the JUICE is really about, in many ways, provoking cities to think about how are they ensuring that their investments are investments that are assets, not just today, but assets in the future. And how do you attract finance to invest in those assets, and how do you take advantage of the opportunities that are put before you? And so I'll talk about one of the opportunities that's going on right now in Philadelphia, and that was the agreement that was referred to in the question. The city of Philadelphia, for the past 30 years, like every city in the United States, has had to develop compliance plans for clean water to make our rivers and streams free of sewage and the overflow that comes following storms. And this is a federal mandate that we've had to figure out. And the traditional answer has been to build more big tunnels. A little bit more sophisticated than this tunnel here, but that's been the traditional solution. In Philadelphia, we've opted to take a different approach, and that is to use green infrastructure to address our stormwater needs in conjunction with some traditional gray infrastructure approaches, but predominantly to capture that first inch of water by greening the city. And the reason that we've taken this approach is really recognizing what is going to be the greatest asset to future generations and what's also going to allow the city to adapt to changes. So we took a triple bottom line approach to analyzing the kind of investment that we were going to make. And when you build these traditional large tunnels, and I will vastly oversimplify this, but basically you rent a big tunnel borer from somewhere in Europe usually, and they send over a dozen engineers, and then there are probably another dozen American engineers who work with them, and then they spend 20 years digging a big hole. And then there are a whole bunch of dump truck drivers who get jobs taking the material out of the hole. And then at the end you have a big hole, and your water goes in that hole, and then slowly you put it through your wastewater treatment plants. Well, we said there has to be a better way. There has to be a way that we can create a real asset for our city. And that approach that we've taken is an approach that says we need to manage this water through investments like green roofs, through really repopulating or reforesting the city with trees along our streets, through managing the stormwater through porous pavements, and through making a whole series of green infrastructure investments that are going to have benefits that go beyond stormwater. So in 1993, it was one of the hottest summers in Philadelphia. We had more than 100 people die of heat-related causes. A few summers ago, we had another very hot summer, and thankfully, because of the work of our health department, we did better, but we had dozens of deaths. Things like street trees can help mitigate those urban heat island effects in really important ways that can go so far as to save lives. The EPA has recognized that the Philadelphia approach is something that they want to partner with the city on in a way that they haven't with other cities, because while other cities have pursued individual interventions, no city other than Philadelphia in the United States yet has come up with the kind of master plan approach that has been able to convince our federal regulators that we can really meet the challenge of keeping our water clean and do it without just building a big hole in the ground.
Great. Thank you so much. Walter, moving to you, if I might. I'm wondering if you can bring in, your agency does a lot of work with private sector stakeholders, and wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you work with private sector stakeholders and how the private sector can work with different levels of city government effectively to promote sustainability.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'm going to do this in English. I think it's easier. There's more people speaking English than Portuguese here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with our juice makers. As the state of Rio, we're trying to, like Rodrigo said, my comment on green economy is if you ask 20 people what green economy is, you'll get 20 different answers. Possibly 30, probably more than that. But I think we can all identify green economy in practice when we see it. And I think that juice is an example of that. I think the Joint Initiative on Urban Sustainability is a way of transforming, creating this new concept of development. And I think that part of it is redefining partnerships. And I think that the key to the success of any new development model and anything that is related to the green economy is how strong your partnerships are and how you build these ties. And I think that the city of Rio and the state of Rio have developed very strong ties over the past few years, and now internationally speaking we can connect to all these great experiences. And at the center of all of this is the private sector. It's a reality that a lot of people don't want to accept when talking about the green economy, but the private sector is at the key of this, it's at the heart of this, and it is the way for us to deliver all of these investments and to create all these projects that we want. The way that we've been working with the JUICE, we have this concept of the green development districts, these green development poles, which is really at the heart of our work together. What we're looking at is to bring to Rio a different concept of infrastructure and to bring to Rio a different concept of companies. What kind of companies we want to bring to Rio? What kind of future do we want? What kind of private sector do we want to be here in Rio? As most people know, Rio Invest has a lot of companies that are in the old economy. We're talking about a lot of oil and gas. We're talking about a lot of steel. We're talking about these heavy industries that have been in the state for a long, long time. And we want to bring about also new companies. We want to bring companies that are thinking about the green economy, that are thinking about the future. The green development poles are a very good moment to try to bring people who are thinking not only about new technologies, and I'm not talking about just renewable energies and solar panels and wind power, but we're also talking about companies who understand that the success of a company goes much beyond their quarterly earnings. In the same way that the state is redefining its success, that it's not only your GDP growth that defines that your state or your city or your country's development. So we're trying to bring together a private sector that has this different mentality, that is willing to go beyond the financial bottom line to understand that energy efficiency, yes, we will have our financial return, but water efficiency and the social inclusion and the quality of life of those who even work in the company are part of this. So the first green development pole that we're developing is at Ilha de Bom Jesus at Fundão, which is an example of how we're starting these partnerships with the private sector. And we've lined up a series of companies mostly focused on research and development who are interested in having new infrastructure in place where they work, and who are interested in thinking in future technologies that will bring about the green economy as we think. So a lot of, and I think tapping into what Shalini has already talked about, is what kind of infrastructure we need, how can we bring smart grids and shared utilities, and how we can promote efficiency in the system in these locations, and how we can give it scale. So it can start at a small pilot, but it will pick it up and it will be translated to other areas. How can we talk about mobility? How can we talk about the quality of life of the people who are working there? So a lot of the companies that we're working with, and for instance, GE and L'Oreal are example of companies that are willing to take this step further and try to help us establish this new concept of an industrial sector, of an industrial area. And more than that, they're trying to think with us, how can we create this finance and how we can develop this finance. I think we can talk a little bit later about the green environmental asset exchange that we've been developing in the city of Rio, which is a way to tie in these environmental assets, which a lot of people talk about, but what on earth are environmental assets, and how we can create these environmental assets. And so our partnerships are a lot about that, on thinking together. Since we're creating something completely new, we don't have the answers, the city doesn't have the answers, the private sector doesn't have the answers, but together, sitting down and talking, we've been able to reach a series of conclusions that I think will be very beneficial for everyone.
Great, thank you. In a challenging economic environment, it becomes more difficult, certainly for cities, and I think for every level of government, to think long term and to think about long term investments, and to think about projects and programs that may come with a higher upfront cost, but ultimately are more sustainable and more economically viable in the long run. A question for all of the panelists is what do you think are the most compelling arguments at your various levels of government to thinking long term? And maybe we can start with you, Shalini.
Well, I think one of the answers was actually in Andrew's response to the first question. And it's one of the things that can really help cities invest in the long term is being able to build flexible systems. That's one of the things I've learned the lesson most by working with our local partners, is recognizing how many day-to-day challenges all of you face that are not visible at the national level. And when we have policies in place that promote large infrastructures, these very inflexible systems, these giant sewer drains that you're stuck with for 100 years, 200 years, it doesn't give cities the opportunity to adapt at the pace of urbanization today, where citizens are changing, needs are changing, and communities are shifting very fast in a way that I don't think we've seen before. And I think being able to bring large investment to these small projects lets you build a more flexible networked system, where instead of trying to replace a whole water treatment plant, you're talking about replanting a section of trees or adding things at the margins. And I think that's one of the things that that I think has the greatest potential. One of the other things that I think we underestimate is that we tend to assume that these systems cost more. And that's often an assumption that is locked into thinking that got us into the mess that we're in the first place. And I've found, talking to investors all around the world, it's not a matter of how much something costs. Often an investor will tell you that you're doing something too small for me to be interested in. What is important is being able to say, what is the value created by this investment, and how does that return to the communities, the public officials, and the public authorities and the investors? So, for example, when you're talking about urban heat islands, there's absolutely no reason you cannot structure a fund that is based on water system investment in trees that help absorb water, but that the hospitals locally are interested in paying into because they're saving in costs when they have to deal with many, many cases of asthma at the same time, or many, many heat-related incidents at the same time. So I think what we've found through the JUICE is that there are really a lot of creative opportunities to not see things as costs, but instead identify stakeholders who benefit somewhere else on the opposite end of that cost. And that's what this partnership has really done. It's created a flexible way of bringing together ideas and opportunities that can turn into large-scale action rather than small experiments.